Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Fiona Watson, who is Research and Advocacy Director of Survival International, the global movement for tribal peoples' rights. She has been with Survival since 1990 and worked on many campaigns for Indigenous peoples' rights, notably with the Yanomami, the Guarani, and the Awa in Brazil. She has visited many indigenous communities in South America and is a specialist on uncontacted tribes in the Amazon. She carried out field work with the Quechua indigenous community in the Peruvian Andes for her master's degree and lived in the Brazilian Amazon for 2 years in the 1980s. Fiona, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered. I'm delighted that you could join me today.
Me too. Thank you very much.
So before I start asking questions about your work, I'm really sure that our audience is curious to know how you became interested in defending the indigenous peoples of South America. Why have you dedicated your life to this cause?
It actually started when I was a child. I was brought up from the age of about 8 for 5 years in South Africa. And so for those who can remember, that was at the height of the apartheid regime. So I was living in a country that lived with this awful institutionalized racism. And I saw the effect it had on peoples, and friends of mine were involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And that always stayed with me as a child, seeing this terrible injustice. And then when I was studying at university, I had the chance to go to Peru and work with the Quechua people in a very small, virtually monolingual village high up in the Andes. And I saw the same institutional racism. I was amazed because I thought this is a predominantly majority indigenous population in Peru, yet they are still being treated in this awful racist manner in a colonial way. So that got me fired up. Wow. And then when I started at Survival, of course, it was mainly because it was working with indigenous peoples. And I'd lived in Brazil before I started at Survival, and again, saw what was happening in Brazil with indigenous peoples. That was just as Brazil was coming out of the military dictatorship. So very profound racism and human rights violations had been happening.
Wow, that's an amazing story. So those who have been following the news in Brazil have seen the images of sick and starved Yanomami people, which has shocked the world. Could you start by giving us an idea of the extent of this humanitarian crisis in the northern Amazon region of Brazil?
I think it's enormous. And I think even those of us who've been following this for years don't really know the true extent. And that's partly because it's a very remote area. The Yanomami territory in Brazil is 9.6 million hectares. That's the size of Portugal. And then on the Venezuelan side, it's almost the same size, a bit smaller. It's an incredibly difficult area to access. So we are seeing these awful images and I've been having reports. In fact, this has been known about for several years. It's not new. Hutucari Yanomami Association, other Yanomami indigenous organizations, the indigenous movement in Brazil, Survival and other NGOs have been denouncing this for years. But it is deeply shocking seeing these images. You know, this is an area of very rich, biodiverse Amazon rainforest. The Yanomami are a people like all indigenous peoples who have their land, enjoy a very good life, normally under normal circumstances, a healthy way of life, totally self-sufficient, living as hunter-gatherers, fishing, cultivating crops in their forest gardens. So to see these starving images is absolutely shocking. And I think it does reveal, it shows that this is a man-made humanitarian crisis.
So how did it happen? And what is the responsibility of the Bolsonaro administration to allow this to happen?
There has been a history of invasion of the territory since the mid-1980s, when there was a huge wave of gold miners went in, 40,000, with very disastrous consequences for the Yanomami. And then after the demarcation of the territory in 1992, most of those miners were removed. One or two small pockets stayed. The current crisis really started to unfold in about 2015. For a number of reasons, partly the gold price going up, but it really became considerably worse, much worse, under the Bolsonaro government. So that's from 2019 onwards. And that was because the government actively stimulated the invasion of indigenous territories, land grabbing, and principal among those mining. And Bolsonaro himself, the former president, has a long history of supporting gold miners. I mean, his father was a gold miner, and he went on the record a number of times as saying this very damaging type of gold mining, the wildcat gold mining, where mercury is used to separate the gold, he was all for it and said so. And in 1992, when he was a federal deputy for the city of Rio, he opposed the Yanomami demarcation. And he went on the record as saying the demarcation of this territory is a crime against the patria, against the homeland of Brazil. And he tried a year later to introduce a bill in Congress to overturn the demarcation. So in other words, he's always had it in for the Yanomami. He's utterly opposed to demarcation and land rights for indigenous peoples. So I think under his government, it was almost like a revenge thing. It's like, right, the Yanomami have got their land. I haven't been able to stop that, but let's go in there and we'll all benefit and use it as a cash cow at whatever cost.
I had no idea that his father had been a gold miner. I know he was an unlicensed dentist practicing in the countryside, but I guess he also did some gold mining in the Amazon region or in other parts of Brazil.
I'm not sure where it was, but I think, yes, it was on the side, yeah.
And I think also for our listeners to understand this, that explain a little bit about why mercury is so important to this process and also why it's so damaging to the indigenous peoples of a region.
Well, mercury, which is actually a controlled substance, and Brazil has signed up to the Minamata Convention, which controls the use and the sale of mercury because it's so toxic, because once it's in your body, you can't get rid of it, you are poisoned. And the mercury is used by the gold miners to separate the gold. It's a process where they sort of heat up the gold and so you get these vapor fumes coming up into the atmosphere, but also loss of the mercury when they've cleaned the gold and separated it leaches into the water systems. So for indigenous peoples who rely entirely on rivers and streams, for drinking water, for bathing, but also for eating fish, which is an important part of many indigenous people's diet, the fish have swallowed the mercury, or it's contaminated the fish. So when the Yanomami or other indigenous peoples eat the fish, that gets into their system. And there have been some very shocking studies by Fiocruz, which is one of Brazil's leading public health organizations. They've done a number of studies, not just actually with the Yanomami, but with other people like the Munduruku, who also face a massive problem of illegal mining and gold mercury contamination. The studies show, I mean, it's absolutely shocking. In the core mining areas, in particular one place called Aracasá in the north of the Yanomami territory, over 90% of the Yanomami that they surveyed had dangerous levels of mercury in their bodies. Wow. I mean, well over the WHO recommended amount. And once it's in there, I mean, people might remember the terrible photographs coming out of Japan, from the Minamata disaster. It's there, and so already Yanomami babies are being born with high amounts of mercury. One Yanomami told me the other day they're losing their hair, they're scratching their bodies. And the thing about the mercury, it's almost like a hidden killer. So this is like a ticking time bomb. So the diseases we're actually seeing now, the awful consequences of malaria, TB and pneumonia and malnutrition and starvation, that's very visible to the eye, as in those terrible photos you mentioned. But the mercury, you can't see that. It's a hidden but very, very dangerous thing.
And wasn't part of this health crisis the fact that the Bolsonaro government refused to ship medicines, anti-malaria drugs, and other activities that were stolen, and there wasn't the kind of treatment of the indigenous people over this last 4 years? What was the role of the federal agency that allegedly is protecting the indigenous population in this regard during the Bolsonaro government?
Yes, well, CESAI, which is the Indigenous Secretariat for Health, or the Secretariat for Indigenous Health, I think was extremely negligent. Medicines that were destined to the Yanomami didn't get there because they were siphoned off, or when they did get to the territory, the health workers, and some of the health workers tried to do the best they could under very difficult conditions, were threatened because the gold miners are heavily armed, so they gold miners would turn up at the health posts in the territory and say, we want the treatment, even though the medicines were destined to the Yanomami. And I think it was all part of the way that the Bolsonaro administration completely dismantled all the federal authorities responsible for things like the environmental protection. So that's IBAMA, the Environment Institute, FUNAI, which is the Brazilian government's Indigenous Affairs Department, and the Ministry of Health. They were deliberately weakened. So budgets were slashed or cut, money, corruption, saw a lot of money being siphoned off. And then, the Bolsonaro response to the pandemic, to the COVID pandemic, was just laughable. I mean, it was unbelievably irresponsible, and sending in things like malaria tablets to treat COVID. I mean, it's completely inappropriate, and doing nothing to stop the miners going in, who were bringing in, still are bringing in diseases like malaria and COVID. So it took the Indigenous organization, APIB, went to the Supreme Court to force the Bolsonaro government to create sort of barriers to prevent outsiders going into Indigenous territories. That was a Supreme Court order, because the government just was utterly negligent in terms of health.
Wow. So some people have been using the word genocide to describe what's happened with the Yanomami. Is that a word you would use?
I would, because what has happened in the last 4 years with the Yanomami, in my view, is intentional. I mean, the Genocide Convention talks about the intention to wipe out or destroy a people in part or in whole. And the Indigenous movement and the Yanomami and Yekwana Indigenous organizations, Survival International, ISA, the Socio-Environmental Institute, many human rights organizations in Brazil. In fact, a whole group of people got together in a big campaign, Fora Covid, Fora Garimpo, Garimpeiros, miners out, COVID out. And this was in, I think, 1920. There have been so many...
2020.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, 2020, yeah. So there have been, so many letters denouncing the situation, campaigns. The Organization of American States Commission, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, issued precautionary measures, which means that the Brazilian government, as the signatory to the Declaration of Human Rights of the OAS, should have taken measures to stop all this in the Yanomami territory. Of course, they ignored it. So it was not for lack of knowledge. So in that sense, one can only conclude that this was deliberate, that they had no intention of solving or resolving the situation, of treating the Yanomami health. They knew what was going on, and they did nothing. And even worse, they actively encouraged the invasion.
So what's been the response of the new Lula government to the crisis?
Well, I think it's been very interesting. I mean, for Lula to go up with several new ministers in his cabinet within 3 weeks of taking office, to fly up to Boa Vista, to see it with his own eyes. So he went to what's called the Indigenous Hospital just outside the state capital, Boa Vista, where he saw the terrible state, the starving children, emaciated elders. He talked to them, he talked to health agents, he talked to Yanomami leaders. And so he saw it for himself. And it clearly had, I think he was deeply shocked. And to hear, I think to witness that with your own eyes, you can only, only feel shocked and extremely concerned. So I think so far that it's been very positive. They've sent in a specialized health team to do diagnosis of what needs to be done, and they've reported back. They've blocked off the airspace. They're setting up a field hospital outside Boa Vista next to the Indigenous hospital and inside the territory. These are all really positive signs. But I think what I'm concerned about, I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm concerned for the long term, because we've seen so often in the past, particularly with the Yanomami territory, it's been constantly reinvaded, including that enormous invasion I mentioned in the 1980s. So I haven't seen any sign yet of what the mid to long term proposal is, because there's no point in removing all the gold miners if they're going to get back. So they have to come up with a proper protection plan. This has to be done in consultation with the communities and Yanomami organizations. And, there's no lack of technology. I mean, and especially, somewhere like INPE, Brazil's Space Research Institute, can monitor things in real time in the Amazon using satellite imagery, drones, etc. They need to beef up protection in the territory. So that's creating protection posts, cutting off the rivers where the gold mine is. Most of them have gone in fluvially by boat. And they need to address the whole issue of the illegal gold supply chain. And there are all sorts of reports coming out now about how the gold has been laundered. It's going all over the world. I mean, it's going to Switzerland, Italy, UK, Saudi Arabia, India, China, Canada. I mean, this is a massive operation. So they have to address that problem. And I think crucially as well, if this operation is to have an impact on the criminal gangs and the masterminds, the sort of big business interests and politicians, local politicians who are behind it and who are benefiting immensely from it, they have to investigate these people, bring them to court, try them and imprison them for their crimes. So accountability, impunity can no longer be allowed to reign.
So as I understand it, you were recently in the United States raising consciousness among people and saying that there was a good response in regard to the Yanomami issues, including meetings with Brazilian government officials. Can you tell a bit more about your visit to the United States?
Yes, well, it was interesting because the delegation of Yanomami artists went along with Davi Kopenawa Yanomami, who's a Yanomami shaman, leader and spokesperson and president of Yanomami, the Yanomami association called Hutukara. So this group of Yanomami went to open a large exhibition of photographs of Claudia Andujar, who's worked for decades with the Yanomami on their land rights, and the work of the artists. And this opened in New York at the Shed. So the Yanomami were all gathered there. And I think a lot of them feel that it's also important to show Yanomami culture, to show the very close relationship that they have with the forest, which is not just one of, oh, the forest is like our supermarket. It's also a very deep spiritual relationship. So they opened the exhibition and I went there for that. And then I traveled on to Washington with Davi Kopenawa and Dario, his son, who's the vice president of the Yanomami Association, Hutukara. And we had a number of really interesting and positive meetings. We met with the State Department and USAID and a number of Congress people. And this was really to draw attention to this terrible humanitarian crisis and to ask or to discuss with the American authorities what measures they can take to support the Yanomami and to support the Brazilian government and what it's doing. And I think it is important that this issue is kept alive. So, for example, inevitably, Lula has many challenges, many issues to address. There will come a stage when this is not going to be in the spotlight anymore. So I think the question of international pressure is very important. That was one of the issues that was discussed. Also, potential support for the Yanomami institutions themselves, because naturally they are the ears and eyes on the ground and are very important in this whole question of protection for the territory. We also had very good meetings with the Organization of American States, including the Secretary General and various people within the Organization of American States. And that's a very important body because they've done a lot of good work over the last few years, raising the issue of violations of indigenous people's rights in Brazil under the Bolsonaro government. And they're important because they are always there, putting pressure on governments, reviewing the situation and using whatever mechanisms, whether it's the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights or indeed the Inter-American Court, to press for justice to resolve these questions. So they were good meetings. We didn't actually meet any Brazilian government officials.
Oh, okay.
But I think the fact that some of the people the Yanomami met in Washington were going on to meet people in Lula's delegation that met with President Biden last week, they said, yes, we're going to raise the issue of the Yanomami in our bilateral meetings. So that was positive.
Wonderful. This is really good news. Lula, as you mentioned earlier, appointed several indigenous people to important roles in his new government, including Sonia Guajajara as the minister for what I call the original peoples of Brazil, and Joênia Wapichana, the first indigenous person to head the National Foundation for Indigenous People, the FUNAI, the government agency that oversees indigenous affairs. So what are their main challenges, and how do you see that you follow Brazil for many years, you know how historic those appointments were, but how is that going to play out in your mind?
Well, I think it's fantastic to have these appointments, and it's absolutely right, because it's part of throwing off the sort of colonial mentality. And as the indigenous peoples, many have said to me, it's an indigenous victory. I mean, it was the indigenous movement in Brazil that pushed for these appointments. And Lula then, put it into his election manifesto and complied with it. So that's all really great news. I think the challenges are immense because FUNAI has been totally weakened. I mean, it was Bolsonaro put in a whole load of military people, ex-federal police people, all the good people that in FUNAI left or were put on sort of out to grass, as it were. So you have an institution that's incredibly weak, that's lost a lot of in-house knowledge, and has a very small budget and not much clout. So I think for Joênia, there are massive challenges. But I think the fact they've already hit the ground running, and I've heard, on other issues, like, for example, in the Javari Valley, I understand there's going to be a big investigation to illegal fishing and mining there. But the challenges are going to be immense, not least because even if you have a president and ministers in the government that are, or appear to be and are, I think, supportive of Indigenous rights and want to see justice and racial equality, etc., Lula is still faced with the fact that he has a predominantly hostile Congress. I mean, hostile to Indigenous people's rights in particular. And so for anyone, I mean, Lula's very wily. He's had years of experience in his last presidencies of negotiating these issues, but nevertheless, it's going to be tough, and they're going to have to be compromises. And so how this plays out in the Indigenous field remains to be seen. But traditionally, that's always been an area where Indigenous rights, because it's always been thought by politicians, well, there are not many votes in Indigenous people, so we can, negotiate away their rights. Of course, with Sonia and Joênia and people like Celia Chakriabá, who's a federal deputy, there are more and more Indigenous voices now, very able Indigenous lawyers. So the scenario has changed, and we have this, young, dynamic, and experienced Indigenous movement, and they're going to hold people to account. So it's very difficult to answer that question, but there will be massive challenges. And I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be in the south of Brazil. I mean, look, everyone is focusing on the Amazon, but if you look at the Guarani land conflict, that is one of the worst in Brazil, without a doubt. And it has been like that for decades. You have a people that's one of the largest Indigenous populations in Brazil, with almost no land. They've been thrown off their land in the last 100 years, high rates of malnutrition, very, very high suicide rate. It's an absolutely desperate situation. And previous governments have attempted to solve that, but you have these landowners who've been occupying Guarani territory for years, who are judicializing the whole process, using the courts to prevent Indigenous peoples from going back onto their lands from where they were evicted.
So I was struck when you were describing the people appointed by Lula, the role of women in the Congress and in the executive branch. Can you expand a little bit more about that phenomenon? Because I think a person unfamiliar with Indigenous culture would assume that it was patriarchal and there was a dominance of men. And yet it seems clear that Indigenous women have played a very important role in the leadership of the movement during the Bolsonaro government and before. Talk a little bit more about that, if you would.
Yeah, I think in many Indigenous societies, one can go into communities and think this is immensely patriarchal because the men are doing all the talking and the women don't seem to be there. But my experiences, even I mean, many indigenous societies are actually very egalitarian, especially hunter-gatherer societies. So in fact, they're not patriarchal. I mean, they are egalitarian.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, there are some indigenous peoples, like the Wayuu, who in the border of Colombia and Venezuela, who are matriarchal.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's easy to think sometimes that the indigenous women don't have a say or power, but I've seen that behind the scenes they do. They really do. They do. And I think more and more with things like in the younger generation of indigenous people who, some have been to university or who've had some form of schooling, who use all sorts of social media to communicate. This has given them, including women, a voice and a following. And so I think that might partly explain the phenomenon. And also just individually, women who, anywhere in the world, you get women who really are movers and shakers and speak their mind. And that's the same in indigenous communities. And I think they're having more access now through social media and communication. So, I mean, I don't think there's any one particular reason. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah. I've been in meetings with Sonia Guajajara, and she's just an enchanting person, a very warm and attentive person. I was really surprised at how attentive she was to me, who maybe in her mind, who am I? But an amazing leader.
yeah.
So
I hope it'll bring a new dynamic as well, having all those women, in Congress and in these positions are sort of much more reasoned, if you like, sort of.
Yeah, and you're seeing the same in the Black movement in Brazil, that very wonderfully strong and powerful and articulate women have been in the leadership, and it's been a very important, I think, element in the evolution of these movements. So thinking back a little bit to the visit to Washington, D.C., when Biden and Lula met, and Biden, who had promised in an electoral campaign quite a bit of money to support the Amazon, pledged an initial $50 million, which some people might say was pretty small peanuts. I can imagine he's trying to figure out how he could get this approved by the Congress when the House of Representatives is controlled by the Republicans. But what is the relationship between the environmental movement, concerned with protecting the Amazon rainforest, addressing the issue of climate warming and global warming, and the indigenous movement? And what is the role that indigenous people can play in a model of sustainable economic exploration of the Amazon as a new path for the region?
I think the role of indigenous peoples is fundamental. And if you look at all the data coming out, the scientific data coming out of the Amazon, it is clear that they are the best guardians of the rainforest, and not just the rainforest, actually many biomes, whether it's indigenous peoples in the Arctic or desert areas. And the data coming out of the Amazon proves that. So they are fundamental to the solution. And I think the environmental movement encompasses many different organizations and ways of thinking and being. So of course you get the activists, more radical type of environmentalists who are keen to work with indigenous peoples, and that's critical. I mean, if the rainforests are going to be protected and conserved as part of our global concern with mitigating the impacts of climate change, it is absolutely essential that the indigenous peoples are out there in the front, and that they're not just consulted, but they are active partners. And the best way to start on this path to mitigating global warming and climate change is to recognize indigenous territories. That is absolutely crucial, because it's shown through the data that they're the best guardians, the best protectors. There's very little deforestation in indigenous territories because they're on the front line, and we know that. I mean, there's many peoples, the Guajajara, the Munduruku, peoples in the Javari Valley, where Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips were murdered last year. All of these people, partly as a response to the negligence of the previous government, but the Bolsonaro government, have formed forest guardians groups, and they're on the front line. And indeed, paying with their lives in some cases to protect the forest. So this knowledge, this incredible knowledge, because these peoples are scientists, Indigenous peoples are scientists, they're botanists, their knowledge of medicinal plants, zoology, all informs the way that they understand and think about the forest. So we have so much to learn from them. On the other hand, what I fear is that you have, perhaps not so much now in South America, but I know some cases, a sort of conservation movement, and you can see this a lot in Africa and Asia, where this idea of we have to protect 30% of the earth to mitigate climate change. We cannot have people in national parks. So Survival is working on cases where there have been horrific human rights abuses, where Indigenous peoples in the Congo Basin are being evicted off their ancestral lands in the name of colonial conservation. And then there are, of course, all these schemes like carbon offsetting, most of which, frankly, are scams. And the sort of message of carbon offsetting is, well, the rich companies, industrialized world, the polluters, the biggest polluters, can pay their way out of pollution. So they carry on polluting and say, well, we're, offsetting our carbon emissions by preserving forests somewhere, which is actually being conserved by the Indigenous people. And there's a lot of evidence now that these not only do they not work and are a scam, but actually they're scamming Indigenous peoples who are not being properly paid or rewarded for this carbon offsetting. So these sorts of solutions, and I'm concerned that these types of solutions with this new government may be attractive to them because they ostensibly look environmentally friendly, but when you actually look at the detail and the contracts that some Indigenous peoples are signing, they're not.
So to kind of conclude our conversation today, which I will admit, I've been extremely moved by your stories and describing in detail the situation. It feels like it's affected me as well. But how can people who hear this podcast or watch you on YouTube, what can they do? What can people do concretely to support Indigenous rights in Brazil, in South America? What can people do to make a difference?
I think there are a number of things they can do. I think it's really important to get onto your senator or congressperson and say you're aware of what's going on, particularly the Yanomami crisis. What is the US government doing? What role is it playing to support Indigenous peoples in Brazil or South America? And there are a number of things they can do to support Indigenous peoples. People can write. Survival has a dedicated webpage. You can go onto our site and you can write to your senator or congressperson using our template letter. You can donate to Indigenous organizations, particularly the Yanomami organizations. Hutukara Yanomami Association has a fundraising page to raise money to help the starving Yanomami, because they can ensure that aid gets there directly through their networks. I think those, to me, the most obvious things at the moment, and then support organizations, campaigning organizations like Survival, or organizations in Brazil. There are many other Indigenous organizations, and I think they could all are operating, the Indigenous organizations, off very small budgets. So you can get in touch with Survival. We work with a lot of them, and we could recommend organizations that people could support. But I think the main thing is just, do not ever feel that you can't do anything. And a very good example of that was the demarcation of the Yanomami territory in 1992. Many people said this would be impossible, but a very long-term campaign by the Pro-Yanomami Commission in Brazil, by Davi Kopenawa, who traveled abroad to talk to people about the fate of his people then, who were dying under the first gold rush, and Survival International, all combined forces to encourage people to lobby and campaign. So vigils, demonstrations, anything that you see that's going on that is talking about Brazil, get involved in that way. Show your voice, whether it's by writing or demonstrating or supporting Indigenous organizations.
Wow, this is very helpful, and thank you very much. I want to thank you so much for agreeing to be with us on Brazil Unfiltered today. I hope you have tremendous success in all the endeavors of your organization and its goals. It's really important.
Well, thank you very much, James, for giving me this airspace and for covering the issues which I think are fundamental. I think Indigenous peoples are vital for the future of humanity, which, as Davi Kopanara always says, we're holding up the sky, protecting the forest, not only for the Yanomami, but for all of humanity.
Yeah. So I hope you've enjoyed the interview. If you are watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.